Всем здравствуйте, с вами Чайная линия, и сегодня мы хотим взять интервью у человека из Австралии, зовут его Дэвид. Он представляет компанию Ларсон и Томсон на рынке уже очень давно, на чайном рынке Австралии. И сейчас зададим немного вопросов по поводу чайной культуры именно в Австралии. Hello David, can you introduce yourself and your company for Russian?
Alex, it would be my pleasure to do so. I'm David Thompson, and I'm from Australia, and I began my tea business in 1992 with a fellow Australian called John Lawson, and at that time I was buying antique furniture and decorative art in northwest India, and I was staying with John Lawson. He was in the garment business. He was manufacturing ladies' clothing in New Delhi, and we both came to the conclusion that there wasn't very good quality tea available in Australia, and the quality of Indian tea we were drinking in New Delhi was much, much better than what we could find on the supermarket shelves or in the specialty shops in Melbourne. So we decided to enter the tea business, and John had regular containers going from New Delhi, in some cases from Rajasthan, to Melbourne on a monthly basis, and there was always room inside those containers. So the first shipment was of an Indian tea brand called Lokchu, and we just put it in with the garment orders, with the Madras check shorts and the shirts for young women, and that was in 1992. And so the business just sort of began really because I was buying this furniture, and I had these old almiras and wooden chests, antique furniture, and there was nothing inside, and I thought, what can I put inside? I have to fill, because with freight you pay for space. So if the chest is empty, you might as well put something inside. And I thought, what is legal to export from India? So I chose a legal drug, tea. Yeah. And so it just began from there, from a very small way, and we've grown from there.
That's inspired you to start tea business?
That inspired me, and also the fact that my grandfather and great-grandfather had had some business in tea, but a long time before my birth. From the 1870s, my great-grandfather was a grocer in Melbourne. He had maybe 15 shops. And my grandfather and his brother had a business in Colombo and Singapore and Melbourne in the 1890s. So in my blood there's tea is in my blood. Yeah.
Tea business is a family business.
Yeah. To some degree.
Do you like tea, and what tea for you?
I love tea, and if someone says to me, what's my favourite tea? It's well, what mood am I in? And then what time of the day is it? And what's the weather like? And so many things. So I tend to probably start with something strong in the morning. If I do have English style tea, I'd have it in the morning, but I'd make it Indian style. I'd put the milk and the sugar and the black tea into a saucepan, and I'd add some sugar, and I'd bring it to the boil and make a sort of an Indian, very strong caramelized, thick Indian style tea. In winter I'll do that. In summer I'll never have milk or soy. I'll always have white teas, green teas, oolong teas, everything.
Like in Russia, in our country also, people in different times prefer different tea. It depends on the weather.
Yeah.
Depends on the temperature.
Well, and I think that's the beauty of tea, because it's not just one thing. There's every flavour is available. So when people say to me, I used, sometimes when I do trade shows, and I said, "Oh, would you like to try some tea?" And they say, "Oh, no, I don't drink tea, but I think." Well, what is tea? There are so many different flavours. Almost, I can't believe that people can't accept one of those styles of tea,
I think the same.
Yeah, yeah.
Try with tea. It's,
I will.
fancy English and kuncha. It's a good one, I think. Have you ever tried?
It's got a beautiful colour and a very long palate with some sort of high notes. So from Shishiwambana?
No, it's from Linsan.
Linchang. Mm.
Is tea popular in Australia?
Is tea popular in Australia? In my grandmother's era, it was very popular and more popular than coffee. And that's probably from, the 1850s when the Anglo-Saxons first came to Australia and displaced indigenous people. Since that time until probably the 1950s, so for about 100 years really, there was a very strong tea culture, even longer from the first Anglo-Saxon settlement, Anglo-Celtic settlement in the 1780s. Tea was strong. And the links between Calcutta and the port and the settlement at Sydney were very strong from the 1770s onwards. The Calcutta was 21 days by sailing, I think, if the trade winds were correct. And so there always would have been tea coming from India from 1850s or so, and then later on from Sri Lanka. So it was popular then, but then in the 1950s tea started to lose a bit of momentum in the Australian market. And what happened was that a lot of Italians and Greeks emigrated to Australia after the Second World War, and the Italians brought coffee culture with them. And so slowly from the 1950s onwards, coffee started to come up. And coffee now is certainly the predominant drink. It's far more accepted by people. And tea is probably, in a cafe, maybe if they're selling 10 beverages, hot beverages, 9 will be coffee and 1 will be tea, as an average.
I think it's why coffee easy to prepare.
It's
faster.
It's faster. Well, you can put it through a machine, and you don't have to understand the subtleties of this tea, because the thing with each tea is every batch is unique. So you can't use the same rules to make all teas. You have to adjust your water temperature. You have to adjust the amount of time you brew for, and not everyone's comfortable to do that. That's my feeling. So I think it's more out of consumers' lack of knowledge and their slightly fearful and intrepidation of specialty teas, because they realize that you can't just press a button on the machine and it comes out the other end. It requires some thought process and some. You have to. Someone once asked me, "Do you read tea leaves?" And I said, "Oh no." And then I thought about it, and I thought, actually, I do read tea leaves, but I read them to learn how to brew. What if it's a green color? I think, okay, water temperature should be lower. Like that. So we do read tea leaves, but not like a palmist.
I think if you start business, coffee business is easier than start tea business.
The market is much bigger, so it's easier in that sense, but it's also more competitive.
And easier to educate personnel.
Because they want to be educated. In tea, it's not quite as sexy. It's not as appealing, I don't think, to a general public.
And what's the tea is most popular in Australia now?
Probably the tea that I buy from my dear Indian supplier Ajay. But what in the West we call English breakfast. Why you call it English breakfast when you're in Melbourne, I don't understand. It makes no sense. It's actually Indian breakfast, really. Indo-Melbourne breakfast. So it's a black tea, and it's best with milk. It's designed to take milk, and it's a strong tea from the best growing season in Assam, in the northeast of India.
I think it's why because it's called English tea because England start tea business on India.
In India,
many
yes,
years ago,
that's
and
true. There are some
and
indigenous tea plants in India, but predominantly the whole setup of those tea gardens in Darjeeling, Assam, Kangra, Nilgiris, all of that was planted out by people from the United Kingdom.
How many people in Australia know Chinese tea?
There are a lot of Chinese in Australia now. I'm not exactly sure what the total population of Chinese would be, but native Chinese speakers, of course, would understand Chinese tea to a much better degree than people of my ethnic heritage. In terms of how many know tea, it depends by how well you mean know. Most people know a tea bag, 80% of all tea sold in Australia or possibly even the world is in tea bag form, which is a very sad statistic when, the beauty of something like this, and then people hide it in this paper bag with this little rat's tail hanging out the side of the cup, and very ordinary teas.
And for me, tea from the tea bags is like a cola.
Exactly. Or it's like very poor quality cask wine. It just has no personality. It's just a neutral cup. Yes, it's tea, but it's tea without personality.
How many tea stores, tea house in Australia? Are there tea clubs maybe?
Tea stall houses and tea stores, there's a fairly limited number. There was a bit of a rise a few years ago, but as much as Australians like to see themselves as being international and sophisticated, I just don't think the market was quite ready for them. And there were some very passionate people who opened tea stores who had beautiful teas and beautiful quality teas, but it was difficult for them to get traction in the market. And I think one of the greatest difficulties in Australia is the rental, because the property market has been up until recently has been in a very strong positive phase. The rents became almost to the point where it was difficult to actually afford the overheads of the rental overheads of running the shop plus the labour charges and end up with a profit at the end of it. And you'd open a tea shop and then people would come in and say, "Oh, I'd just like a coffee, please." And so how to, But there are lots of tea clubs. So in some ways it's almost like an underground movement where there are a number of people who meet on a semi-regular or even an irregular basis, and they just get together as friends and they have samples or teas that they've bought online from, sometimes from China, sometimes from Japan, sometimes from Taiwan, and they just get together and they share what they've got, and they say, "Oh, I've got some great Japanese green teas from this region, and why don't you come over?" And they'll have some light food and snacks. It might be in somebody's house. So there seems to be a lot of that, so that some of the most passionate people are working that way.
And they get together on the park or on the houses, on the forest.
Exactly. That's exactly what they're doing, Alex. Yeah.
How many companies sell tea by internet in Australia?
I actually don't know for a fact, but I would have thought there'd have to be probably 20 or more. There could be more than that, so probably best not to quote me on the exact figure, but there's a number of them doing that.
Do you sell tea by internet for retail or just a wholesale?
No, I also, my sort of retail window is through the internet. So I do sell my teas at retail over the internet. And then from my warehouse, I wholesale to my cafes and restaurants and other businesses that I've been working with for a number of years, or in some cases just commenced working with.
Are there in Australia some tea festival or something like that? Maybe somebody
Both Melbourne and Sydney have tea festivals. I'm trying to think, maybe 5 or 6 years ago the Sydney Tea Festival commenced, and it was held in a very large sort of industrial, a broken factory area on the edge of Sydney. And the first day there were 10,000 people, and there were 20 of us exhibiting, and it was incredibly busy. It was so exciting. It was a lot of fun, and they've been very successful, and they've continued, and they've been in Melbourne twice, I think, and possibly the third one will come. So generally in early spring, that tends to be the time when we do them, or towards the end of winter and moving into spring will be more accurate. But they're going quite well. So there is a market there, and there's people are interested to learn, particularly younger people who aren't sort of so fixed in their opinions.
And how often tea festival organized?
On an annual basis, just once a year for the Sydney and Melbourne tea festivals, and some other ones I think people have been.
At the same time or different times?
Different times.
And what kinds of tea Australian people prefer to drink, and what about quality? If low quality, high quality, or middle quality? If we talk about whole leaves, not about tea bags.
Okay. If we're talking about whole leaf, I'm sure everyone would prefer to buy high quality, but it depends on how fat your wallet is, or how much your credit card limit is, and what people want and what they can afford are quite often two very different things. At the moment our economy is it's slightly unhealthy, and consumers have been to a large degree sitting on their hands. They haven't wanted to spend money, so I suspect that price will become more important in the next couple of years. And what's generally on offer, loose teas available in supermarkets and boutique supermarkets, generally tends to be of a reasonable quality, but nothing startling. If you want higher quality, consumers are probably more likely to purchase on the internet, because the seller can have lower overheads. They don't need to worry about renting a shop front, and they can probably have a slightly lower profit margin because their overheads are lower, and therefore they can afford to sell higher quality teas with a lower margin, and the consumer ends up, getting a reasonable deal out of it. Yeah, and in some cases you can probably request samples from these companies. You can try out samples of the same style of tea from 3 or 4 different companies and work out which one suits your palate and enter it that way.
You talk about high price on the rent. How much the rent stores per square meters?
Square meters I don't know, because I've been wholesaling for so long. I have no idea of what they're charging, but I would have thought in some of the retail shopping strips in Melbourne, for a shop maybe maybe the land size of the shop is 180 meters or something, but the shop itself might only be maybe 100 meters, and you could be looking maybe on 2 levels, but really the ground level is the only one you can sell from. So you're sort of looking at 50 meters. You might be paying $1,000 per meter per. Let's talk in US dollars, because it's probably easier for your viewers to understand. Maybe $50,000 a year, 50 to 100,000 US dollars a year. That's a lot of cups of tea. It's a hell of a lot. This is a wonderful tea, Alex. Thanks for that.
What's about age of tea consumers? If we talk about good tea, olive tea.
It sort of varies, you know. It's hard to put a finger on, but I'd say there's probably more interest from people younger than me, and particularly people in their 30s. Pu'er has sort of become a tea nerd's choice. There's a lot of guys drinking raw pu'er. That seems to be sort of a geek tea. Yeah, there's just a lot of interest and a lot of people who are looking into it pretty carefully in terms of regions, and they're travelling. And then these are quite often these are people who don't have a tea business, but they're going to these tea growing areas just because they've got a passion for tea, and they're really interested to learn about the different styles of tea coming from, you know, say for example Japan, or going to Taiwan and learning about the different growing regions in Taiwan, and just getting a very good understanding on the growing regions. In some ways, having a tea business limits you. You know, like I'm so busy running just to keep stock, and I'm very jealous of the time that these guys have to spend just for pleasure. And you know, when you do something for work, for your business, and I'm sure you find the same thing, you don't have time to enjoy as much because you're too busy making sure that you've got that tea and it's being shipped and it's going to arrive at your store in time before you run out of stock. Whereas these guys are just traveling around, they're enjoying, they're really enjoying, it's fabulous. Yeah. I just wish there was more of that. But I think, you know, with social mediums, I think so many people you know, can be connected through mediums like Instagram and others, that there are so many people sharing knowledge about tea, and these are the consumers that you and I sell to, but they're talking amongst themselves and working out what they like, and they're sharing brewing ideas and ideas for tea brewing, all of that sort of thing, which I think is really healthy. You know, I saw that there was a tea festival in Berlin earlier this year, you know, so there's things happening everywhere, you know, which is, the world's a small place now, you know, you can move very easily and very affordably. And you and I are a perfect example of that. Cheers, let's drink to that.
And tea make international friendship.
Yeah, exactly.
And what's about tea fields, tea factories in Australia? Do you grow a tea? Do you have a tea garden?
There's no indigenous tea in Australia, but there are several instances of tea being grown in Australia. I think when the British first stole tea seeds from China in the 1850s, they didn't just try growing them in India. They also sent seeds to the south of India, to the Nilgiris. Some of those tea seeds were sent to Sri Lanka, I think, and some of them ended up in Australia, in Queensland. I'm not sure how successful the Australian plants were at that time, but nevertheless, there is tea grown in Queensland, in the north. I'm from Melbourne, in the southeast of Australia, but in Queensland, a northern state, on the eastern seaboard where the Great Barrier Reef is, an incredibly beautiful part of our country. There's tea grown in the hinterland there, some black tea, and I think that might be mechanically harvested, because the problem we have is our labour rates are very high, because we're very fortunate to enjoy a very high standard of living. So it's just not economic to have people plucking tea leaves by hand. So they tend to shear or mechanically harvest. So you end up with probably more of a commodity tea, which is more suited for a lower priced supermarket variety. But there are some boutique growers of Japanese teas also in Queensland, and also in the state of Victoria. The Japanese company began tea gardens about more than 20 years ago, and those are processed about 2 or 3 hours north of Melbourne, I think more than 90% of their tea production is exported to Japan and turned into tea soft drinks, you know, like tea drinks and things. But I buy some of that shincha from them. And the area where they're growing is our alpine area. It's not like the mountains in Europe. They're small mountains. We're a very old continent. But they're clean green teas, and they're flavoury. They're really good. But I don't think there'll ever be a huge tea industry in Australia simply because of this labour issue. And also probably lack of knowledge about manufacture.
Does Chinese tea start more popular from year to year?
Yeah, definitely. There's a definite increase, but it's only a small number of people who are driving this increase in knowledge of Chinese tea, and I think it's mainly they're just doing a lot of research on there's a huge amount of information and misinformation available on the internet. But if people look through things carefully, they can get a very good idea of the styles of Chinese tea, or some of the styles of Chinese tea that are available. And I think that's certainly driving it to a degree. And so even some of the baristas in the coffee companies are starting to realise that tea is actually probably a more sophisticated and more varied product than coffee is. If you think of, you know, tasting of 30 coffees, gosh, to pick the difference between them, Alex, you know, it's not like drinking 30 different teas from 30 different growing regions in China, you know, which
I agree with you.
Even someone who's never tasted tea before could realise that one was different to the other. They're distinctly different. It's actually easier for people to choose the difference. Whereas coffee, the differences are very slight, and you have to have a highly tuned palate to discern the differences between them.
In our country, many people drink tea for health. Is that the same like in our country?
Unfortunately, yes. And I say unfortunately because every week the phone would ring at least once a week, and someone would, or an email would come, and they'd say, "Oh, I've got some medical condition, and can you suggest a tea for me to drink?" I understand that they've got a medical condition, but I don't look at tea as a health beverage. I'm not a doctor, you know.
Yeah.
How can I advise someone about the health benefits of tea? I drink it because I like the taste. And I think everyone should really just look at it because they enjoy the flavour of a particular type of tea, or maybe in the process of brewing the tea and talking with friends, they relax. And maybe I think that's actually the health benefit. The fact that you decide, I'm going to make that tea to the best of my ability. I'm going to focus my attention only on making the tea and enjoying the companionship of my friends. And I'm not going to worry that my credit card is over the limit, or that all these other things are happening outside of making the tea and the friendship I'm having with my friends. So I don't feel comfortable calling it a health beverage. There are people who are qualified in that area, herbalists and naturopaths. Those people have more credibility. If I start telling people that they'll live to 120 and they'll never get cancer, no one will believe me, and they shouldn't either. You know, so that's my feeling on that area.
If Australian people prepare Chinese tea, what style they prefer? English style or Chinese style for preparing tea?
If you're talking about my mob, the Anglo-Celtic people, many of them would probably still prefer to brew in that English style with milk and sugar, particularly older people. But the generations below me are far less likely to use dairy products. The incidence of veganism has grown rapidly, and people preferring not to eat meat, and that also has affected consumption of dairy products like milk and cheese, etc. So those people wouldn't be likely to drink milk, black tea with milk. They're more likely to move into other areas of green teas, and then the more sophisticated ones will get into oolongs and pu'ers and yellow teas and this sort of
You
thing.
can drink it with milk.
Sorry?
You can drink it with milk.
No, you can't drink any of those teas with milk. There's only really the breakfast teas, those strong Assam black teas that really, they benefit from milk. Yeah.
In our country, many people think if they drink a lot of Chinese tea, they will feel a little bit drunk. Is somebody in Australia think the same?
I think probably in that sort of geeky pu'er set, that with people drinking raw pu'er and pretending that they get high on it, that seems to be the case. But in fact, I'm sure that's to some degree a motivation.
In our country, for many, for one underground group is very important, and they buy Chinese tea because they want to be a little bit drunk.
A little bit high. I want to get high on pu'er, on raw pu'er, yeah. I think there are other substances you can get a little bit higher on.
And you make a tea business many years. Can you tell interesting or maybe funny story about it? One.
I've got lots of funny stories, but one of them that springs to mind is not so much a funny story, but it just shocked me because it was so different to my experience in suburban Melbourne. Many years ago, I was at a tea estate in Assam with a group of Australians. I think there were about 10 of us, and there were 2 jeeps. And we stayed at one tea garden one night. We were doing a tour of Assam, going from one garden to another, to another, to another. And we stayed at one garden, and there was a strike, like what the Indians call a band, which means there was meant to be no movement of cars. And we thought, no, we're moving. And then the manager says, look, it'll be okay. And Assam has some law and order situation, so it's a little bit, not uncommon in these tea gardens for them to have security guards with semi-automatic weapons. To see a semi-automatic weapon in Australia is very rare. Maybe you'll see them. The police will carry guns, but it's not to see these long semi-automatic weapons. So this manager of this tea garden said to me, he said, I'm giving you my best man. Take him with you, put him in the front seat, and when you go through the village, just tell him to keep the gun up so people can see through the window that you've got someone with authority to take you safely. And he said, when you finished with him, he said, you drop him at the front gate of the garden and it'll be fine. So we took him for 3 days. With us, we had our own security guard. I was shocked. And there were some women in the group, and they were trembling, And one eye, he may have had some coloured lenses. One eye was blue and one eye was green, and he had a big smile. He was a really happy chap. It was good, and he loved coming away with us. That was a lot of fun.
What do you think about China, about China culture, about China history? Do you like it?
Before I commenced business in tea and also business in general in terms of buying antiques, I studied archaeology and fine arts at university. So that's my academic background. And then I started business after that. And so I've always been really interested in history because I'm a firm believer that you can't go forward unless you know where you've come from. One of the great beauties of tea for me is that through the front door of tea, I've learnt about the back door history of India, of China, of all these countries that I buy in. One, I really enjoy that because then I get a better understanding of each country that I'm working in. And I love that aspect of tea. And China's the birthplace of tea. 5,000 years of tea. What do I know about tea, Alex? I've only been in tea since 1992. I know nothing.
Nothing. Yeah.
And the longer I'm in the industry, the more humble I become because I realise how insignificant I am in the history of tea. And it's a good thing. You just realise how little you know and how much more there is to learn.
Last questions. What do you think about Russia?
I think that I'd like to visit you in Russia, Alex, because I haven't yet been to your country. And like China, you're a massive country. You have a very long and complex history, which I don't really know much about. And through tea in Russia, I'm sure I could learn more about your culture. And I'd love to come and look at some of your famous museums and your beautiful countryside, and look at some of those fantastic churches that I've seen on your Weixin moments. I'd love to have a look at some of those Russian Orthodox churches and that architecture, that onion-shaped dome, and I'm fascinated and I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, we will wait you on Russia.
Yeah,
You're welcome.
yeah. Oh, thanks so much.
Thank you.
No, thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.